Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Learning Future podcast. I'm, of course, your host, Louka Parry, and it's my absolute delight to be sitting here virtually with two wonderful thinkers and two wonderful gentlemen, Jamais Cascio and Bob Johansen. Both of them have just phenomenal backgrounds. Jamais has been one of foreign policy's top 100 global thinkers. He explores our environment, technology, and culture to build plausible future scenarios. He's a distinguished fellow at the Institute for the Future, and he created the BANI framework for understanding global chaos now in use worldwide. We're going to talk a lot about that. We also have Bob Johansen, who is a distinguished fellow also with the Institute for the Future in Silicon Valley. For almost 50 years, Bob has helped organizations. Bob, you look fantastic. Bob has helped organizations around the world prepare for and shape the future, including major corporations and major universities. He's a social scientist by training. He holds a BS from the University of Illinois, which he attended on a basketball scholarship, and a PhD from Northwestern University. He has a divinity school degree from Crozer Theological Seminary with a focus on world religions. Goodness gracious me. It's wonderful to have you both here for the Learning Future podcast. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We could go in so many different directions, and I hope to. I always begin with this question because this is a podcast about education and learning, and that is, what is something that you are learning at this point in time and this point in your lives? Jamais, we might start with you.
Well, actually, right now, a couple of things, but the one I'm focusing on is the nature of book sales and book publishing. This is my first real book by a real publisher,
Congrats.
And so it's been a learning experience to better understand how the sausage is made, as it were. Just the nature of sales and publicity and the whole process. It's actually really interesting and a little bit intimidating, but I'm glad to be in the middle of it. The other thing I'm paying attention to is just what we're learning more broadly about the nature of language model AI. I just saw an article today about one of the ways there is a system now set up that can determine with about 80% accuracy whether a social media post has been posted by a human or an AI, because AIs are too nice. AIs are not able to post with the same kind of venom that humans are, and when they're tweaked and optimized to post with venom, they just sound unnatural. They're even more detectable as AI. So, on the one hand, a very practical, personal, and the other is just this big conceptual. What is it about humans that make us so evil, and why is that specific to humans?
Wow, that's fantastic. We'll definitely come back to that, Jamais. Bob, what about you? What's something you're learning at the moment?
So right now I'm puzzling and trying to learn about how to describe phenomena that are going on right now. I've done 2 books this year, the one with Jamais and another one on augmented leadership. And I'm working on a new book on the future of faith. And they have the one thing in common, which is these are all phenomena that are very hard to describe in words. And I'm trying to learn about framing, frames theory it's been called, or framing mental models. How do we use language to describe phenomenon that are not actually able to be described fully in language, like artificial intelligence, which unfortunately, that's an awful term. The worst term I've ever studied for an emerging technology. It's just a very bad frame. Faith is another term that very hard to frame and very hard to talk about. Maybe people at Faith are better at that than the rest of us. I'm not sure, because they often bring in God language, which to me makes it worse. So I keep struggling with how do we take phenomenon from the future and apply language, apply models in a way that doesn't distort what we're actually trying to learn about.
Bob, that is so fascinating. Applied linguistics background as a languages teacher. And, I remember coming across cognitive linguistics and going like, oh my goodness, how language shapes thought, and the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and does it shape or determine, and all this fabulous kind of space, especially as we try to, all three of us and many others, try to grapple with what is the future becoming, or what might it become? And so I'd love to take us into the main thesis of your work together, Navigating the Age of Chaos. First of all, why is it an age of chaos? And second, how on earth might we navigate it? Those seems to be 2 pertinent questions at this point.
Well, to answer the second part of that is we navigate it because we have to. because otherwise we are completely adrift, buffeted by the maelstroms. Why do I think of it as an age of chaos? There are a number of terms that people have used to describe what the last decade or so has felt like. Polycrisis, omnishambles is one of my favorites.
I haven't heard that. That's good.
Metapocalypse. So all of these things that sort of that imply the breadth of the chaos, and that's actually the important part for me. Is that this is such a broad phenomenon, not just widespread, but covering so many different categories. It is a condition in which we find ourselves that does not have historical precedent, precisely because each one of the elements of it we've studied at depth. Each one of the elements of this crisis has been simulated and scenarioed and gamed out and examined, but always in isolation. And we're experiencing a multiplicity of dramatic phenomena that combine and reinforce each other. What do you think, Bob?
Well, I think it's a framing problem we have. And one of the things we've learned at Institute for the Future, we're the longest running futures think tank in the world now. So we've been doing this a very long time. And what we've learned is if you frame the future accurately, you're able to prepare for that future, and you've got a better chance of having your preferred future actually happen. If you frame the future inaccurately, you're in a hole, a very deep hole, because you're not at all prepared. And the way this book got started is I've been using the term VUCA since 9/11. And actually the term goes back to the late 1980s, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. May introduced the term BANI in 2018. I was sitting at the front row of the talk that he did about it. And my first reaction was, whoa, why do you need BANI? We've got VUCA. But I've realized that VUCA is no longer VUCA enough.
Wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah, the line I used in my talk, in that original talk, is we eat VUCA for breakfast. It's just so much a part of our everyday experience. We swim through it.
Yeah, but that made me feel so vulnerable in the front row.
Yeah. Well, at the front row,
He's
I
trying to
bet
eat
it
me
did,
for
Bob.
breakfast.
Well, talk about, having to shift one's mental model, or perhaps, go down and look at the kind of, I love this reflection on framing in particular, right? It's not so much this kind of, I think we're always solutioneering too much. We're like, I just find that, problem fixed loop. And, Peter Senge, the systems thinker at MIT, just wonderful work. It's actually, you don't want the problem fixed loop. You need to go down into the observation, the systems and structures, and eventually the mental model, and then come back up if we're going to do anything strategic. And of course, we see this in our work across education systems. These are very robust institutions that have, the test of time. And that's a good thing in some ways, but also as this kind of converging exponential space. And I like Jamais, your comment about often there's this term unprecedented that's thrown around. This is an unprecedented moment. And I think sometimes there is an arrogance that we have with perhaps our nowism, which is, we only have our current experience. We don't know really what it was like, when World War II first kicked off, right? I'm sure it felt pretty remarkable. But this kind of convergent aspect does seem to be really new.
And that's actually something that's been very interesting for me, because when I first wrote about BANI publicly in 2020, got an immediate response from a global audience. And in the production of this book, I reached out to a bunch of different people that have written to me and asked them, what is it about BANI that is useful to you? How do you use this? And while they all had a variety of answers, the one that stood out and was replicated across nearly all of them was that it gave name to a phenomenon that they were afraid to describe because they felt like they might be overreacting. By giving it this name, the words have power. It's the magic of naming. It allowed them to see this as its own phenomenon and not something that they were simply, again, having an overreaction to, that it is something big and different.
Right.
Beautiful.
And what we struggled in and how this book idea got going was Jamais and I began talking about a positive BANI. How could we flip this to something positive? I had done that with VUCA in my earlier books, that volatility yields to vision, uncertainty yields to understanding. complexity yields to clarity, and ambiguity yields to agility. And I found that very useful. I teach executive groups. I teach at the Army War College. It's been a useful way to flip that concept positive. And I began asking Jamais about that, and we began a dialogue back and forth about what would constitute a positive BANI. And then we thought about, well, how could we get on the ground examples? And we brought in Angela Williams, who's the CEO of United Way Worldwide. Angela's on the ground with these people that are experiencing the VUCA and BANI, experiencing the BANI world already. And we thought this would be a great way to add lots more on the ground examples, because Jamais and I are both futurists, so we're more abstract. We kind of live our lives future back. Angela's on the ground.
Yeah, living kind of present forward. Take us into BANI a bit, because most people listening to this conversation will have heard VUCA before. You know, even in the education space, it's kind of been articulated, especially over the last 10 years, say. And I really like your flip as well, Bob, towards, okay, well, what's required to navigate that? But take us into BANI, like define it for us as well, because for some people, in fact, I would say most listeners, they would never have come across this kind of conceptual frame before.
BANI is an acronym that comprises brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. And these four are all, in many ways, they are much more human-focused than the language of VUCA. They're very descriptive of how one feels, how this world feels. And with brittle, I'm talking about systems and structures that look strong, act strong until they hit an inflection point, and then they shatter. So they seem strong until they're not. Anxious is just that feeling of dread that we all seem to have, and is particularly acute among younger people. This feeling that there are no good options left. Nonlinearity is a term from mathematics, but I've been using it more broadly to talk about, among other things, climate and disproportionality of power, disproportionality of inputs to outputs, lag in time. There's a whole issues around climate hysteresis, and that I go into in depth in the book, that helps to really reinforce the idea that we can't just assume a straightforward cause and effect system anymore. And then incomprehensible initially got a lot of pushback on that, because it seemed to imply that there's stuff that the human mind can never understand. And that's not really what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about what. I'm talking about why. Why are these things happening? Why are people pushing back against doing things around climate? Why are people pushing against vaccines? Some of the terms that I use to go along with it are unthinkable and absurd. And so this world really describes what it feels like to live in this present, and what it will feel like for at least the next decade, and probably at least two.
It sounds like a beautiful description, and everyone listening, I'm sure, will just find different parts of their life or their world or the worldview that are resonant with that. I guess I don't think it's too much premature. What do we do, therefore? Because in our work in human systems, like schools, for example, or higher education, we really are trying to empower people to be creators of their own future rather than victims of it. We talk a lot about agency, for example, in education systems, especially the progressive ones at this point. We still talk a lot about academic achievement, which I would say is a subset of the skills that we all need to thrive. But yeah, what do we do? What do we do now? They have this kind of, I would say, quite visceral reaction to this moment, which sometimes can feel a bit, paralyzing at the same time.
For sure. And what we've done in the book is to draw people in to the concept and basically to ground them, to set their expectations. But then we've also created a new frame, which is the positive BANI frame. And this is one that Jamais and I work back and forth on for months to come up with. But it boils down to, in a brittle world, you've got to be bendable with resilient clarity. Resilient clarity. And you can't have certainty. In an anxious world, you've got to be attentive with kindness and active empathy. And I don't know if you've seen, this book just came out last week.
I love Prof. G. Yeah, Scott Galloway.
The number one seller on in America right now on Amazon called Notes on Being a Man, Scott Galloway. But it particularly talks about the difficulties of being a boy or a young man in the United States right now. But it applies, I think, more broadly. So it really requires a kind of attention and an active empathy, a kindness, a community sense. It's such an angry time. You know, it's such an angry time right now. Then with a
I bring up, when we've talked about this, I bring up, my wife has a T-shirt that I love, and I always quote for this. It's a T-shirt that says, "In a world where you can be anything, be kind."
Yeah.
And it so beautifully encapsulates the point we're trying to make. But please, go on.
Yeah, and it'd be nice to put on the back of the shirt, "In a world like that, why be angry?" You know,
Yeah.
that there's just so, I mean, there's reasons to be upset, but to be angry, especially kind of angry at specific people, or revenge. You know, revenge is such a big motivator and such a dangerous one. In a nonlinear world, you want to be neuroflexible, basically teach your brain new tricks. And improv comes in here. Luckily, we've got all these wonderful methods of improv that come from comedy. We work with Second City, for example. They've got a corporate improv group now, theatrical improv, yes and kind of improv for conflict resolution. You know, improv is a kind of melody of hope where you're kind of reaching out, yes and embracing that future in a hopeful way. And finally, in an incomprehensible world, you want to be interconnected to as many different important points of view as possible. And you got to be really careful about labels and about categories. They're really dangerous in the BANI. And, you know, kind of big takeaway, the underline is the BANI future is going to reward clarity, punish certainty, because certainty just won't be scalable. Certainty is brittle, and brittle breaks.
Gosh, there's some good stuff in that. I can just, you know, it does feel like a bit of a collective breath out as you think about some of those aspects, a melody of hope. I just find that just absolutely wonderful. And I'm also a trained drama teacher. So for me, it's just you're speaking my language, right? You know, even
That's
the kind
great.
of how does one adapt? How does one meet the moment? How does one sense make and respond? Even quality of attention. I really do. I think it's a Simone Weil quote. You know, at the end of our lives, they will have been what we paid attention to. And I think we just if you'll step back and take a look at, if we all audit our lives in terms of what we're paying attention to, how much of that is sacred and how much of that is profane. It's just this really interesting moment, you know, the kind of desanctification of everything, the zombification of the human spirit is something that I'm quite concerned with. And just for your information, here in Australia, we're the first country to try to put a social media ban in place up to the age 16. Denmark is following suit. It's going to be imperfect.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting.
Moment.
It's really a question of whether that strategy will work, though. That's a very heavy-handed strategy. And I think the question is, how do we engage and motivate and essentially draw people in? You know, I grew up with social media, so I had an internet identity in 1972 when it was called the ARPANET. You know, I was one of the first humans to communicate through the ARPANET. And I was so optimistic about it, about, gee, this is a great way to connect people. This is a gift economy before it was a market economy. And it was a friendly, humanistic community before it was an angry one. So how do we capture those good things about all this connectivity? And how do we try to discourage or kind of get around all of the negatives? I don't think prohibition is the way, but I don't know what the way is. That's the challenge.
I'd love, just while we're in this context, some of your reflections on the role of technology on human development. It is one of the biggest questions that we find in our work.
Yeah.
You know, the mobile phone. And I agree with you, Bob, that these technologies, they came in with remarkable potentials, and I think the market forces have somewhat driven them into attention extraction. So I think it's debatable, but you know, if you look at the Center for Humane Technology, I think they have a strongly held view on this. Professor Jonathan Haidt has been quite influential for us in Australia also with his anxious generation work, which again has its criticism, as it should. What do you think we should do? Like, even like a learning environment of the future for the future. What might that look like? What are the principles that need to underpin it? Considering we've kind of detailed out this BANI positive, response.
Jamais, you want to start?
As something I said to Bob before we started, sometimes it's hard not to come up with a sarcastic response.
Well, you can also do that. That's fine. The paradox of it all.
I do agree that prohibition is a heavy-handed approach, but we're in a moment where so many of the tools that we have devised have, dual use is a term out of international politics, dual use technologies, things that have both civilian and military applications. But here we're talking about things that have both positive BANI and negative BANI applications. Social media is an excellent example of that. It's a technology or a technological milieu that was seen from the outset. I mean, I wasn't quite as early as Bob, but I was in the early 80s on the internet in the early 80s, and so I watched the web grow up.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that we were so hopeful for was the way that the internet would give marginalized people a voice. And in many ways, the canonical example is a gay kid in a small town in Kansas suddenly having a community that he could communicate with. And that was great. And that happens. And that's a really important value of the internet and of social media. We kind of forgot that the bad people that we've marginalized also get a voice. And we didn't really think through, how do we deal with that?
Yes.
One of the things that when I've given talks about just technology in general and technology broadly conceived, technology is a cultural artifact. It emerges from our culture and our societies. And we always when we think about a new technology, we need to think, how will this, not just how this can be used to lift us up, but how could it be abused? How will people use this to make money? How can they use this to commit crimes? How can they use this to have sex? I mean, what are the ways that the technology can be used in ways that the designers never intended? And that's not necessarily a moral question. It's really we have to think broadly. We have to think much more broadly about what our technologies can do. And so one of the things that I've been pushing for in conversations I've had around education really comes down to trying to understand technological developments in a cultural context. Not just how do you use this new toy, how do you use this new device, but really, what does this device mean? Where does it come from? What might it do to us? How will this affect relationships? That's a really good starting question. How will this affect relationships? And I think that's going to be a really difficult topic to cover, in part because, as you mentioned, market forces really push us away from thinking about these technologies as cultural devices and much more into thinking about them as, either money-making or money-consuming devices.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think just to think about where we are right now and these challenges we're facing, it's very tempting, I think, to say, oh, we need guardrails or we need prohibition up to a certain age. And I'm not unsympathetic to that. I think Jonathan Haidt's book and I think the new Scott Galloway book, both of whom are arguing for something similar, they're very thoughtful. So I think the conversation is well worth having. But the metaphor we use, instead of guardrails, the metaphor we use is bounce ropes, like around a wrestling ring or a boxing ring. So those bounce ropes have 4 stanchions. And the 4 stanchions are the things you're non-negotiable about. Those don't move. But in the middle, there's bounce ropes that allow for flexibility and experimentation. And with young people, they're going to grow up as digital natives, or it's not just digital natives now, it's cross-reality natives or AI natives, or where they're really going to grow up with this tech. And there are positives about that. There's dramatic positives. So, for example, those kids that play the right games, they're going to be able to model the future better than any of us. Those kids that are prohibited from doing anything are going to be starting behind of the gamers. You know, do you really want that? Do you really want your smartest kids to bail instead of to learn the humanistic part? But you do it within the frame of bounce ropes, you know, where and this is difficult teaching because it's really hard. It's much easier to just outlaw stuff and create guardrails than it is to create bounce ropes, because the teachers have to actively involved in the learning with the kids, and they've got to learn the stuff first. And there's a real sense in which we as elders, and I'm older than the two of you, but you're elders too, compared to the kids who are growing up digital, they've got competitive advantage over us unless we take it away from them. You know, so how do you engage with this? It's not easy. It's not easy, but there's no simple solution to this. And another thing Jamais and I learned in our work with our publisher keeps telling us, write a one idea book. You know, that's what's selling. The one idea books are what's selling. It's kind of what's the one idea around BANI. We didn't want to do that because there isn't a one idea solution.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think there's something really interesting about, I don't know, first of all, I love the bounce rope metaphor. That's just such a more powerful way of understanding, you know. I often reflect that as human beings, we're not spreadsheets, we're Venn diagrams, you know, and we're likely kind of adaptive Venn diagrams.
Yeah, I like that
saying that I say all the time. Because there's something about, but we try to somehow compartmentalize, categorize, label, and then become calcified, if we're not careful, into that understanding of what the human spirit is, or the human capability, or even the knowledge set, or know-how. So I find that, I find that a really wonderful way of thinking about how we interact with these technologies. And of course, I like, you know, Jamais, your reflection as technology really is a cultural artifact. You know, it's always coming out of a particular moment in time. Fire is a technology. It's all technology. But the question is, again, how are we deploying this? How is this, and I know this is too simplistic, but how is this in service of an individuation process that helps me serve the collective more powerfully? Or how is it countering that? And in some ways, I think I even have my own reflections on user-centered design, which is if we remove all the pain points from a human being's life, eventually, what does it mean to even be human? You know, and I think in some ways it started in a really very well intended. And now I think what we see is, I definitely see, like, you know, rise in mental health challenges across our young people. And you go, well,
yeah, definitely.
Put them into nature, that probably is the best teacher. You know what I mean? You know, in some ways, you know. I have a question as well. We haven't covered it. Jamais, you go first, and then I'll
I was going to say very quickly that one of the things that always impressed me about Institute for the Future when I first started doing projects with them, 15, 20 years ago, is that a significant plurality of people who work at the Institute have an anthropology or sociology background.
Interesting.
And these are people who are not coming in. You know, there are some people who come in from it with a technology focus, but by and large, a lot of the people at the Institute come in with a human and an understanding of human culture and society approach to thinking about the future. And that really impressed me.
Yeah.
Not just because one of my undergrad degrees is anthropology, but
Well, it feels good to be among friends. But there is something really powerful about that, the human dynamics being centered rather than the kind of productization of something being centered, perhaps. And both, of course, have their own merits in terms of what you're trying to do. I want to talk, you both to just briefly talk explicitly about this moment in AI. Similarly, we have a range of things happening across the world with, you know, guardrailed, Bob, I'm using that word explicitly now, guardrailed chatbots that have been built by, you know, Department of Education and rolled out to teachers and students. And of course, it's run by an LLM underneath it, but, you know, it prevents certain activities and has a few safety aspects to it. But where do you think we're going with this whole AI aspect? And I would just note, I love the augmented intelligence frame far more, Bob. Thank you for that, as opposed to the artificial intelligence piece, because I just think that doesn't summarize the use cases that we're seeing emerge. So what's your reflection right now in terms of this moment? You know, 2020, by the way, this will be out of date in 1 week, but that's okay. We'll have a...
You go first on this one, Bob.
Okay, because Jamais and I have had lots of dialogues about this, and we have different views on it.
Interesting.
But I think both are valid in a way. I've learned a lot from Jamais about this. I've been experimenting with ChatGPT for a couple of years now. I write books, and I give talks, and I do custom forecasts, and I realize it's specific to me, but I've nicknamed my version, a customized version, Stretch, because I'm using it to stretch my thinking. And that's all I'm using it for. I don't trust it. I never use it at the end of a project. I never check citations with it, for example. It's always at the front, but it's also always on. So my forecast is that 10 years from now, we'll all be augmented. And we chose to dedicate the book I did on augmented learning. We chose to dedicate it to Doug Engelbart, the guy who coined the term augmentation. And he was arguing with the AI people at the time that augmented intelligence was a better frame than artificial intelligence. And I think he was right. So I think now, if you think future back, as I do as a futurist, we're all going to be augmented in some way 10 years from now. It's just a question of how. So
Right.
I'm prototyping my way to that with Stretch, and I'm learning a lot. I just saw the prototype last week from Apple of a lamp that is sitting by your side that I hope will replace Stretch soon. And it's like a lamp that moves in humanoid ways, kind of cocks its head if it's wondering, and then it can turn around and project. So it can be voice or text communication back and forth, but it doesn't pretend it's a human. You'd never think of the lamp as a human. It's like digital plus a bit of humanoid, where I think a lot of the current conversation is human minus, which we've got a long way to go to simulate a human. And so much of today's LLM stuff is all about efficiency. And that's fine if you want to do it. I'm interested in effectiveness, doing the right things.
Yeah.
So I think that's where it's going to go. It's going to be more conversational and less like a question and answer jukebox.
Yeah. Brilliant. Fascinating. Jamais, what about your view? Where do you differ from that, if there is a difference?
Well, I don't trust LLMs, period. I don't even have one. I don't use them because I'm just so bothered by their how they are constructed, the out-and-out theft of intellectual property that went into the construction of nearly all of them, the way they are designed to be obsequious. And again, I don't want to talk about Stretch because I haven't experienced Stretch, and I know that's custom built for Bob, so I don't want this to sound like I'm talking about the work that he's doing. But just from my experience of them more broadly, and especially the academic articles I've read about and studies I've read, the obsequiousness is built in. These are our own personal worm tongues, if you've read your Lord of the Rings. They are the ones who are whispering in our ears, telling us what we want to hear.
Great reference.
They're designed to tell us what we want to hear, which is why we get so many problems of instructing the chat bot to do XYZ, and it says, okay, I'll do so, or I won't do that. And then he turns around and does the opposite because it's trying to live up to what you want, or what it thinks you want. And that really bugs me. And I really would hate to have a world of everyone augmented by their own whispering worm tongue. But at the same time, I think Bob is absolutely correct that we will be living in a world that is increasingly augmented. It's really, the question for me is, how will that augmentation manifest? What will it do to communicate with us and observe us? Because one of the things that is an unfortunate side effect of an augmented society based on the current broad categories of artificial intelligence technologies, it becomes an immediate surveillance society. If you have to have your microphone always on to listen for you to say something, it's always listening. If you have cameras built into your glasses to keep an eye on what's happening around you, they're always keeping an eye on you. And we have learned, and this is something that is, I think, one of the hard-won lessons from the rise and fall of the web, is that one thing we've learned is that these will always be corporatized. Under our current economy and culture, these will be corporatized, so such that the glasses that you wear that keep an eye on things and listen for everything, that's not just going to you. That's being run through somebody's digital system, somebody's bank of computers trying to extract marketing data, trying to extract political data. And that's something that you can tell that I wrote more of the worrisome side of the book, and Bob wrote more of the positive side of the book.
A good dynamic, though. It's a good creative tension.
But I really worry about how readily our technologies that we use to augment ourselves and help us as individuals and as families and communities get turned into marketing data.
Yes. Yeah, and I'm really glad Jamais has the point of view he has, and that there's the amount of work going on. I guess for me personally, I do want to be involved, and I've been able to program Stretch so it isn't just telling me what I want to hear. It argues with me, but it argues with me very politely. Because I want it to be polite, because I prefer that kind of, soft on people, hard on ideas kind of interaction. But I want to be involved. So I'm really glad there's people looking at the negative side of it, but I want to be involved because I think something's going to happen. We're going to be augmented whether we want to be or not. And I want to be involved. I want to.
I just feel similarly, I'm glad that there are people like Bob out there getting deeply involved in the evolution of this technology, because it helps me remember that there are aspirational goals that can still be reached because of people like Bob. Yeah. And so it's a mutual respect, mutual about AI. I think we came to a decent compromise over the course of the book. Both in terms of how Bob uses Stretch, and he makes a point in the acknowledgments at the end of emphasizing his use of it, or talking about how he uses it, and in the text of the main text of the book, just talking about the tension and the duality of this kind of system, not just as a technological device, but as a participant in our community conversations.
Yes. Yes, and I think this is also a good reflection of what good co-authors are, where you really have significantly different perspectives. And part of the co-authorship is not necessarily resolving, but at least coming to terms with those different perspectives.
There's so much good stuff there, gentlemen. I love the creative tension, just like kind of witnessing the two of you kind of go back and forth on this view, because it really does represent, a both and. It's kind of a transcendent conversation. It's to include and transcend. Yes, it will be this and potentially this. I share the same concerns of, surveillance capitalism that Naomi Klein would call it, right? Or the attention economy, if we put it a bit more softly. But also, the incredible upside that, a human individual that has passion and drive can create something remarkable now. And, so understanding like what's made possible, it's just such a beautiful moment, I think, for that. And not just what can we do quicker, the efficiency dividend, Bob, but how can we do the right things? And so this whole idea of the sycophant GPT models or chats that we have at the moment, I think deeply problematic, because you're in your own echo chamber now. It's just an echo chamber of one versus, someone challenging the way that you see the world and what that enables.
One of the points we make in the book is that efficiency is brittle. That the more you push for hyper-efficient solutions, the more brittle the system becomes. Because when it works, it may work beautifully, but when it breaks, it shatters catastrophically.
The entire thing, yeah.
As we have seen. I think the computer crisis from 24, I'm suddenly blanking on the name of the...
Oh, yeah. So 18% of the world's computers went down, and all our flights were grounded. Yes, I recall.
Because they were trying to do an upgrade quickly and efficiently, and they didn't properly test it, didn't have a way to back out of it, and it was just utterly catastrophic. And it's one of those things that doesn't get talked about. It's not just that computers went down; it's where they went down. Not just for airlines, but for the National Health Service in the UK. And you think about if emergency responders and National Health Service systems went down, some people did not get their health care in time.
Yeah.
People died because of this crisis. And what's one thing we try to emphasize is that there are human consequences to these kinds of efficiencies. And there are human consequences to taking the steps to be resilient, to be attentive and empathetic, to be neuroflexible and improvisational, and to be interconnected and inclusive. There are positive human consequences too, and we should really be striving for those.
I love that. I have two final questions for you both. The first is kind of from your lens, because you're two fantastic futurists. I've learned so much just through this conversation. What would be a comment that you would gift educators or administrators working in schools, wherever they happen to be? You know, what's a lens from what you've learned about this human aspect, Jamais, that you were just speaking to? That's my first question. My second question is going to be, what's a singular take-home message that you can gift us? So first, just a comment on schools. Bob, let's start with you. What's something you could say about the kind of process of human development and growth at this moment of this BANI moment?
So let me just say, I really admire teachers, and you all have more patience than I do. I was a college professor for a year, and I just don't have the patience to do it. And I really admire people who do. So all this is said with the greatest admiration. As a futurist, the suggestion I'd give to you is to ask, what is it that your kids have that you do not have? And essentially, what can you learn from your kids? Because I think the single most simple yet profound change that I recommend in big companies is cross-generational mentoring. If you can get people from different generations to work together, and hierarchies work against that. You know, they tends to be, as you rise in the ranks become homogeneous in terms of age. And I'd look for ways to bridge those gaps and essentially to do reverse mentoring. I really believe in reverse mentoring. I really believe in kids. So it's great that we're trying to keep kids out of trouble. But I'm also concerned with how do we learn from kids, because I'm convinced they know stuff we don't. And I'm really optimistic about them if they have hope. But if they don't have hope, then all those other things are looming.
Yeah. Thank you, Bob.
I think my answer parallels Bob's in that in an age of chaos, in a chaotic world where technologies are changing so quickly, where politics is changing so quickly, where the environment is changing so quickly, there will be many situations where both the educators and the students will be learning simultaneously, learning at the same time about these new developments. And lean into that. Learn with the students. Not just, not trying to get ahead of them, but actually use them as colleagues in this and be open about we're all learning this. This is a new thing. But also make clear where your mental framing, to step back all the way to the beginning of the conversation, where your framing comes from. Why do you think about what's happening in the ways that you do? I mentioned in the book that the term that I like best for futurism is anticipatory history. And the emphasis is on how, the kinds of mental models we have around history can be turned around and look forward, and we can use them to look forward. And similarly, in a world that's rapidly changing, being able to use the models that you've built and explain them and help the students develop their own, that strikes me as being the perfect toolkit for an age of chaos.
That's brilliant. All right, final question. A single sentence, something that you feel really kind of is resonant with, something we should keep in mind as we step into this anticipatory history that we are shaping around us. What do you want to leave us with?
My takeaway is develop your clarity, but moderate your certainty.
Mine is a simple one. The future is uncertain, and yet we must act.
So good. Gentlemen, it's been an absolute delight to speak with you today. Congratulations on the book, Navigating the Age of Chaos, a sense-making guide to a BANI world that doesn't make sense. It is just it's such important work for all of us to help navigate what's around us and what we want to create. So thank you both for joining us on the Learning Future podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you
very
Louka.
much.